Hello Zero Books readers. In this video, we'll take a few quotes from Agata Pyzik's 2013 book, Poor But Sexy, and Yasin Kakande's Slave States, as we attempt to respond to and correct Tucker Carlson's Prager U video entitled Illegal Immigration. It's About Power.
The slogan first became famous 50 years ago thanks to Cesar Chavez. He was the founder of the United Farm Workers Union. When Chavez said, "Si se puede," he meant something very different. Yes, we can seal the borders. Cesar Chavez hated illegal immigration. He was Hispanic, obviously, and definitely on the left, but he fought to keep illegal Mexican immigrants out of this country. He understood that peasants from Latin America will always work for less than Americans will. That's why employers prefer them. Chavez knew that. As long as we have a poor country bordering California, he once explained, it's going to be very difficult to win strikes.
What Tucker Carlson does in this video is interesting, and if I'm being honest, a little scary. With the usual, almost cute Prager U animations, and without a hint of irony, Tucker is using the real concerns of the working class in an attempt to drive a wedge between workers. His argument isn't unique to him, but was already made in the National Review back in March of 2017. In an essay entitled Hail Caesar by Mark Krikorian, the argument was made that the labor hero Cesar Chavez had views on the border that would be a perfect fit in the Trump administration. As a child working with his family in the California fields, Cesar quickly learned the reason farm workers were paid so little and treated so poorly. As his biographer Miriam Powell writes, quote, "A surplus of labor enabled growers to treat workers as little more than interchangeable parts, cheaper and easier to replace than machines." It is widely recognized that labor mobility has served the interests of capital well since the late 70s, or during what's known as the neoliberal phase of capitalism. The use of cheap labor to maintain profits hasn't just been a mainstay for U.S. production. Migrant workers are hyper-exploited all over the world. For instance, the Zero Books author Yasin Kakande's book, Slave States, is an expose of the enslavement, trafficking, and general abuse of workers in the Gulf Arab region. In it, he wrote, "Migrants come for work, but many ultimately find themselves exploited and abused. Millions of workers have no means of escape and few rights. The fruits of imported workers can be seen all across the Gulf states, not least in the form of huge skyscrapers built on migrant labor. But the experiences of these individuals are usually hidden below the shiny surface of the cities and go unreported and unheard." And in Agata Pyzik's 2013 book, Poor But Sexy, she describes the situation in Europe. Quote, "Every day, dozens of cheap flights carrying a migrant workforce from Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe are launched back and forth from the British Isles, and everyday racist articles in the gutter press seem to tell a different story. 3 decades ago, Eastern Europe was on everybody's lips because of communism, revolution, invasions, workers' struggles. Now, Western newspapers, if they write about us at all, it's because we comprise an Eastern danger to the British job market." What this points to should be obvious, namely that the trouble with the demand for labor mobility is not the foreign-born workers themselves, but the system that takes advantage of economic inequality between nations in order to set workers against each other. The effect of imported cheap labor isn't uniform. The importation of workers has different consequences in different eras and different conditions. For Cesar Chavez, during his struggles to create a farm workers union in 1969, the importation of illegal workers from Mexico absolutely undermined his efforts to organize and make demands. Today, the consequences of importation of cheap labor isn't so clear. According to a report from NPR in August of 2017, economists disagree about whether or how much an influx of immigrants depresses wages. Some have found that new immigrants depress wages for certain groups, such as teenagers or workers with a high school diploma or less. Others say that the overall effect on the economy is tiny, and an influx of immigrant workers revitalizes the economy overall. What is clear, however, is that the importation of cheaper labor from poorer regions is not the only threat to native workers. Another, perhaps more significant factor is the continued development of automation and manufacturing in other sectors. However, let's grant the Trumpian right their interpretation of the data on immigration for the moment. For example, let's take George J. Borja, a professor of economics and social policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, whose work has been marred by controversy and who's been cited by President Trump. Even if we grant him the legitimacy of his argument, we can see that it doesn't lead to Trumpian conclusions. Borja writes, somebody's lower wage is always somebody else's profits. In this case, immigration redistributes wealth from those who compete with immigrants to those who use immigrants, from the employee to the employer. And the additional profits are so large that the economic pie accruing to all natives actually grows. I estimate the current immigration surplus, the net increase in the total wealth of the native population, to be about 50 billion annually. But behind that calculation is a much larger shift from one group of Americans to another. The total wealth redistribution from the native losers to the native winners is enormous, roughly $500 billion a year. Reading Borja's argument, a quote from Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, comes to mind. Marx wrote, "In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin when in the black it is branded." What Marx was saying was that the demands for better conditions, specifically for shorter hours, could not be won for as long as the threat of replacement by slave labor hung over the heads of white workers. The black slave struggle for freedom, for emancipation, was, according to Marx, of central importance for the working class as a whole. And if we can keep this lesson in mind, we can start to see how it is that Tucker Carlson is no friend to the working man.
What changed is that Democrats stopped caring about those workers, about the middle class, really. Why? Here's the answer in 4 simple facts. 1. According to a recent study from Yale, there are at least 22 million illegal immigrants living in the United States. 2. Democrats plan to give all of them citizenship. Read the Democrats' 2016 party platform. 3. Studies show the overwhelming majority of first-time immigrant voters vote Democrat. 4. The biggest landslide in American presidential history was only 17 million votes. Do the math. The payoff for Democrats? Permanent electoral majority for the foreseeable future. In a word, power. That's the point, no matter what they tell you. American workers be damned. I'm Tucker Carlson.
Zero Books is not a fan of the Democratic Party, nor do we think that the Dems were ever serious advocates for working people. That said, Carlson's conspiracy mongering in this section of the Prager U video is both disingenuous and destructive. Tucker points out how some Democrats have taken a stand against illegal immigration in the past, but he could have also noted how both Democrats and Republicans have made it easier for undocumented immigrants to gain legal recognition as residents or citizens. In 1986, for example, Ronald Reagan both supported stricter controls on immigration at the borders and the creation of a process for amnesty.
And I supported this bill. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
Do the Democrats want to grant citizenship rights to legal immigrants with the hope of securing an insurmountable demographic edge on the Republicans at the expense of working people? Not exactly. Well, it's true that liberal think tanks like the Century Foundation have been predicting that a more diverse American population will help the Democratic Party. They've been predicting this since 2002. This has not come along with a marked softening in immigration policy. Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief. Hillary Clinton voted for the Secure Fence Act to control immigration at the border. And in general, the policies of the Democratic Party have been roughly in line with the middle-of-the-road approach conservatives like Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bush Jr. took. All of Washington sought to strengthen border security, root out recently arrived undocumented workers, make the hiring of undocumented workers more difficult, all while providing, as George W. Bush said in 2006, a rational middle ground between granting an automatic path to citizenship for every illegal immigrant and a program of mass deportation. Again, Ronald Reagan required undocumented workers to register with the government, pay their back taxes, and demonstrate some knowledge of American history and English before they could apply for legal status. More than 20 years later, Barack Obama would require undocumented workers to register with the government, pass a criminal background check, and pay their fair share of taxes before they could apply to stay in this country temporarily without fear of deportation. Again, the Democratic Party's own behavior doesn't indicate that they were simply trying to open the borders in order to stuff ballots. And when you look at the demographics themselves, it's fairly clear that the tactic wouldn't work even if they were. For example, if all the undocumented immigrants in Ohio had been granted citizenship rights before the 2016 election, and if all of them had voted for Clinton, Trump would still have won the state. Further, it's unclear how strong a hold the Democratic Party really has or will continue to have on Asian voters, Latino voters, or even African immigrant voters. If Tucker was truly interested in the plight of working people, if he was doing something other than trying to stir up paranoia and racial resentment, he would have asked this question: to what extent do naturalized citizens who are afforded legal protections have the potential to help the working class? One answer to that question might be found in the biography of Cesar Chavez, whose grandparents fled from slave-like conditions on a plantation in Chihuahua, Mexico, in order to start a new life in America. It was, after all, the generational struggles of the Chavez family that produced the man we remember as Cesar Chavez. It was Chavez's grandfather's flight from exploitation and oppression in Mexico that led to the creation of the United Farm Workers Union and a better life for migrants in America. American citizens, whatever their ethnic heritage, are unique in the freedoms that they enjoy. And we have a history of working class struggle that we often ignore. From the perspective of working class solidarity, and in order to further our own interests as native workers, we should absolutely support providing those of us who are the most exploited a path towards legal recognition and citizenship. Back in 2011, I interviewed Jefferson Cowie about his book Staying Alive, which is about the white working class in the 70s. To close out this video, I want to play a clip from that interview. This kind of leads back to the whole premise of your book, which is examining what went wrong with the working class and how the New Deal working class collapsed and what the potentials are for a new kind of working class. And, we're kind of knocking around the edges of asking the question and being concrete, which probably in a way we can't be, as to where the new potential is and what kind of working class person we want to see.
Yeah, if you want to see potential, you have to look at the new immigration. I really think that's where it's come from. The big May Day protests the last couple of years in Los Angeles, justice for janitors, other groups like that are really, I mean, I really think that's the forefront of working class identity. The problem is, of course, a great deal of America is suspicious of anything immigrant.
Right. Well, doesn't that set up the same kind of zero-sum game where you're pushing a certain segment of the working class, but that segment happens to be the segment which will help the capitalist class overall? Like all the women go to the workplace, so now everyone has to have 2 jobs.
Yeah, that is the untold tragedy of the 1970s, right there.
Right. So, I mean, with the immigrant movement defining labor as the center of it being with immigrants, I'm not being racist here, but it just seems to me that weakens labor overall.
Yeah, I think actually economically you could actually prove that, but socially I think it is the degree to which those working people are absorbed into a broader identity that might be called working class, that would that would go hand in hand with the Dewey Burtons of the world, and that's the test. Because if we go back to the rise of the modern working class in the 30s and 40s, it was the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were seen as unskilled and unorganizable and some racial other category who were locked out, right? And they gained their citizenship under the New Deal, and it was when those kind of native-born, skilled, white male workers began to see a little bit of their fate tied to these other people that doors began to open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that definitely, if we can make the struggle a common struggle, that would be a huge step forward. Overcoming how the immigrant struggle is being isolated would be.
That's right. That's what I'm right. Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, you might click on that subscribe button and the bell. You might also consider supporting us on Patreon. We're now offering patrons access to select Zero Books titles and the opportunity to join in a monthly Zero Books Club discussion group online.